Hey folks, MasakoX here. It may not be surprising to any of you out there, but Dragon Ball Super Superhero has been gearing up for its release in the last few weeks. Whilst we had been railing against the production for a while due to events with some of our fellow creators being involved, now that those things have been removed for the time being, we can now both get back to, Havrock and I, covering this rather intriguing story. The last two trailers of the Dragon Ball Super Superhero movie, which is coming out in late April in Japan and Kami knows where elsewhere in the world, have definitely warmed audiences up to the whole ambience of the movie, what it's trying to go for. As we all know, it had been subjected to a massive swathe of hatred toward it just because it was CG, because it existed. People not really taking into account the sheer amount of groundwork that is being laid here. It was vitriol for vitriol's sake, and that's just sad. I think the last trailer though, and recent information that dropped, have worked wonders for the overall perception of the project. Not only did these drops manage to, mostly, sell its CGI aesthetic, but by also showing us that certain 2D elements would definitely be used, it's allayed some fears. On top of all that, it's hyped us up more for some character-related things, which is a very big plus in our book. Things that we have wanted for years, and have finally been addressed within the official story. Characters that, whilst they definitely have their fans, haven't been usually on the priority list when it comes to making new content for them, or threads that the series has been targeting in the past. Now, that seems to be changing for the better, by evolving backwards. I'll explain later. It's a nice tonal shift though to see Gohan, Piccolo and Pan doing stuff actively throughout the entire movie, as well as having the likes of Yajirobe and Korin back for some major outings. And also, Ultimate Piccolo. Gonna be so smooth and shiny. Yes, we're fairly confident that Piccolo has had his potential unlocked, like Gohan, either via Gohan doing the ritual for him, or the Elder Kai offering it to Gohan's best friend and teacher, or it could be something else entirely, something that Piccolo's cooked up himself. But it's definitely a viable power-up. It's just a shame though that Piccolo doesn't have any hair, because we really can't tell here whether his bang is down or not. It's pretty weird, I know, but we can bet you that he can now blast some pretty smooth special beam cannons. But we're not going to be talking solely about the movie today. We already have a discussion for that in more detail, which I would like to point out to you here, for something more concentrated in that regard, because like the audience itself, our beloved franchise is no stranger to having tonal shifts throughout its entire tenure on screens and in books, which usually are connected with the opening of a new chapter in its history. Moments where you can definitely tell that they are going in a different direction, be it narratively speaking or creatively speaking. Say what you will about his present work, Tadayoshi Yamamura's visual change to Dragon Ball in 1992-1993 is the one thing that stands out the most, visually speaking, and has lasted the test of time. For decades, in fact. Credit where credit's due there. But we're going to be mainly taking a look at what we've had so far, what it seems that we are going to get in Superhero, and what might be crafted further down the line. Let's begin. Alright, so it goes without saying that the original Dragon Ball was much more wacky and carefree when it came to its overall atmosphere, at least initially. Dragon Ball, the first series, was much more surreal and focused on comedy and normal senses of power than it is today, even though the stakes might have been higher in relation to the main character. Sure, you didn't have space threats or perils like that, but that wasn't on the radar at the time. At that time, powers are kept in check to meaning that King Piccolo's attempt to subjugate the entire planet to his liking was quite a big deal, facing the greatest demon in history, and then turning it into Green Edam. Without the whole Saiyan ordeal, or at least not there for the foreseeable future, the series had been much more adventurous and wasn't taking itself too seriously, as it would tend to do later on. You gotta remember, Toriyama was coming from series which were extremely immature and driven by gags and comedy, but they did make bank. Dragon Ball was a relatively tame example of some of his work, which you can now check out, by the way, via the Manga Theatre book available at Viz for a decent price. This isn't a sponsor, by the way, it's a recommendation. Convenient too. But with the Ball of Dragons series, enemies were often than not comic reliefs. There was much more humour going around, and most importantly, the characters played second fiddle to this biggest trope of the show, that it was all about the journey, not the destination. You took yourself through different lands and environs to get to your final destination, but the chance to see what Earth was made of was rather thrilling and entertaining. To see Toriyama's Earth come alive, feel like it's lived in rather than just a place where the characters sleep. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we didn't have some moments when we were scared for our characters' safety, as the Red Ribbon Army did tend to be rather ruthless and desperate while they were around. And although a bit wacky himself, Mercenary Tao was a really serious threat for his time. The fact that someone so goofy could end people with his tongue, and yet was so effective and final, it was sort of an odd thing to experience the first time around. A surreal way to end somebody, that's for sure. You were definitely going to remember that. However, that wasn't the biggest deal to befall Dragon Ball. The first real major tonal shift that you could definitely say was true was when we discovered that Krillin had been tambourined. Immediately, the stakes were raised. Sure, our main characters got hurt before and were in risk of injury, but nobody in the main roster had died before now. For Krillin to be subject to that was quite a big drop for the audience to deal with. Things had changed forever. And although we live in a world with magical wish-granting orbs, we also have discovered that no one is truly safe. If our deuteragonist, that's second in command by the way, can be killed off, and in a rather gruesome manner to boot, who else was up for the chopping block? And yes, it wasn't using any gore or spurts of red stuff, but the impact and suddenness of that incident was enough to make up for it. In a sense, Goku's fight with both Piccolos felt like a prototype for what was going to come, in the animated version known as Dragon Ball Z. This was a testbed, the King Piccolo saga, for what Toriyama wished to do with the world and property going forward. A big bad that shows up, and their heroes have to take them down, instead of simple adventures with smaller baddies. And it is also largely the fact that Toriyama was one of the very few shonen artists out there at the time that allowed his characters to literally grow up. And as Goku was growing up physically, the mental element can be discussed for another video, quite frankly, his world was growing and changing as well. The enemies, while still colourful and vibrant, were definitely more menacing and brutal than in the original Dragon Ball. There had to be changes made, or otherwise the manga would have become pedestrian, samey towards audiences. Or maybe the editors would have gotten impatient. Not to say that didn't happen anyway, but it would have happened more and more often. And Toriyama is known for being quite stubborn, really digging his heels. Things could have ended badly for the show. So even with the moments like the breaking of Yamcha's legs, Dragon Ball Z was no stranger in putting Gohan in harm's way. And at the same time, the series got much more stationary. Even when the characters traveled to different locales and stuff like that, they weren't as important anymore as the huge bombastic fights. These places now, instead of living worlds, were more like backdrops to the main event, which was now the fighting. Sure, we got something like Namek, but there wasn't really much else to it. 100 Namekians lived there, and it's green. I mean, you can't miss it, it's green, I guess. This means that the Frieza saga of Z was the moment that had cemented the importance of transformations, that have since become a staple of the series, for better or worse. You take your pick. From this point on, every main villain and every main protagonist went through a series of transformations of some sort and type. For the villains, it's usually 3, or in Boo's case, more than 10. And while Z wasn't exactly devoid of humour, it did have some funny moments nestled within its narrative, it ventured more to some of the darker corners of what stories could be, from what was an otherwise carefree universe, especially with the history of Trunks, that being a prime example of what I'm saying. Yes, Toriyama didn't have that much influence with that general story, but he did give it his approval, and it's definitely the most bleak and dark example of official content we've got going. We also then started to venture into more divine and weird territories with the Buu saga, thanks to the Supreme Kai showing up, whilst also returning to the more amusing and bizarre tropes Dragon Ball was accustomed to. But that was a big mixed bag with some audiences. We've done various other discussions on this topic, but basically, for right now, this arc seems to be an animal of its own. On one hand, it might be the most gag-filled section of Z, but on the other hand, it has some needlessly cruel moments within that series which have become just ones that are just wrong. I think you know which part I'm talking about. that being the biggest grievance I have with the series. But the focus on the divine beings wouldn't stop with Buu and the Supreme Kai. Instead, it was doubled down on. It would become a huge staple of Dragon Ball Super. Biggest message of that series is that the gods are incompetent. But this is many years though after Z had concluded its run. But before we get into that, we do need to talk about GT. Yes, it did exist, I hear you say, whether you shout the contrary or not. Deal with it. To many, it's a cult classic, with the fan favourite Super Saiyan 4 transformation being birthed there, as well as the best ending of any series in the franchise that we got. To others, this conclusion does seem unearned, and what we got might be seen as a disjointed mess which took too much time to find its flow, before being ended prematurely. Both arguments and points are valid. You see, a series doesn't have to be solely good or solely bad. No series is without fault or without merit. There's always something in there in which to praise or scorn. Some of the more questionable decisions that GT partook in, that we can easily see, are connected to the fact that the creatives were trying to preserve the charm of the younger Goku and the earlier Dragon Ball stories, which were mainly focused on the journey and adventures that sprung up from said journeys. But with the added bonus of fan favourites such as transformations and battles. They gave up on that pretty quickly though, after episode 3 in fact, if anecdotes are led to be believed. That's really fast to give up an idea, I have to admit. And while the supporting cast had potential, no one really lives up to any of their expectations, with Pan and Trunks shamelessly sidelined without really having any character development after episode 16, when Baby showed up on Earth. Oh yeah, well okay, Pan gets to cry when Goku goes Golden Monkey, and that's it really. The only character other than Goku that somehow gets any semblance of closure is Piccolo, and even that's pretty debatable. He's just standing there while Earth is burning to a crisp, accepting his fate. Yep, I'm doing this. Really no other option, huh? Well, alright. Having said that though, him winding up as a guardian of Hiffle is rather metal. It just could have been done in a more polished way if you ask me. Now we have Super, which is another mixed bag honestly. And although it seems to have found more solid ground than GT did, due to it being more consistent, not entirely consistent mind, it isn't without its troubles, as we all know about when it first started. We talk a lot about Super on this channel, but one important thing to note is that this is the first series that is aware that Dragon Ball is an international phenomena and part of wider pop culture, which causes it to become meta without even trying. Dragon Ball, Z, and GT were all created for a Japanese market primarily, and whilst they did have a presence in mainland Europe, that was much less influential than it is today. In a way, Super embraces certain memes and tropes about the characters in the world that get very close to breaking the fourth wall at times, especially when it comes to Yamcha. Baseball episode, anyone? While it does mainly focus on divine affairs and ridiculously strong opponents, the anime sections gave us a very good amount of really good slice of life segments that we could spend time with our characters in regular life. And I think we can mostly agree that when Dragon Ball spent time with the daily activities of its characters, it really did well and provided some genuinely good times. On the other hand though, it can get a little much. It often chokes on its own ambitions, which cannot be fulfilled in its current, more kid-friendly state. Like we've said before, Dragon Ball, Z, and GT originally aired on Wednesday evenings in Japan, during prime time. Unlike nowadays, where it's on Sunday mornings at 9 AM. Something has to be reined in, and this new direction of Dragon Ball being a multi-generational medium too now, something that parents grew up with for the original and then can watch with their kids, means that Dragon Ball has to adapt or not get its ideal slot next to One Piece. And sometimes, like with Zamasu in his own arc, it tries to be overly ambitious Dragon Ball, being semi-philosophical, but it falls flat due to the writing not being up to standard with said ambitions. It's a good effort, but half-baked. Okay, let's turn back to Superhero again, which seems like a very clever way of combining different aspects of previous sagas into one whole. It's certainly a Dragon Ball Super story, alright, as we are sure that we are going to see some effective action from Beerus, Broly, Vegeta, and Goku, but by keeping them away from the main action, them just training together on a distant planet, we can focus on some characters that have been very much neglected. Also, while the new Red Ribbon army is colourful and goofy, we see that the power of the Gammas is on par with Gohan and Piccolo, which is very impressive. They're not weak. They're no pushovers. Yeah, if Goku or Vegeta were there, they would be struggling hard, but they're not. We have a grounded Earth-based enemy, following the early Dragon Ball style, but with the resources that put some modern villains in Super to shame. And also, they have strength in numbers. This is both nostalgic and refreshing. Also, by having a big focus on Pan, we might get some of that early Dragon Ball charm back naturally, without the need of regressing Goku, as both GT and earlier Super iterations tended to do. Now let's ask ourselves this. If this works, if this is a good marriage of all of the eras of Dragon Ball, which in our opinion it's attempting to do this movie, what could they do next? Do we want a grittier future? In the animated version, that's unlikely. As we've stated before, Dragon Ball has become a generational time capsule, as well as being a sort of family type of media these days. And we doubt that they would go into that direction, as it would mean that the kids would be iced out, and less toys being sold. But they might go in another direction, one that GT abandoned way too quickly. A brand new journey and adventure. With instant transmission and flying, the world has gotten smaller, but a lot of time has passed since Goku finished his own initial journey. Maybe it would be fun to send Pan out there, to follow in the footsteps of her grandpa, and for her to see up close how familiar faces and places have changed. At the same time, you can have the big guns exploring strange new universes. We can easily have a new show that has two plots, with one focusing on the youngest crew of Pan, Bulla, Marin and Oob, being mentored by Piccolo, Gohan, Goten and Trunks, and Goku and Vegeta, they can traverse different multiverses. I think bringing back the journey to Dragon Ball is important to its roots, and that shift would be welcome amongst the fandom, but it requires way more effort than GT was willing to give. Personally, we don't have that much gripe with the tone of Super, as admittedly, Z, especially dubbed Z, took itself far too seriously and caused many misconceptions within the community. And while there is nothing bad in having serious or darker tones within your story, calling on the spirit of the original Dragon Ball by using it in a more creative way, instead of just banking on Goku all the time, really gives us fuzzy feelings. And if Superhero succeeds with that, the future of the franchise may look pretty bright. If you like this discussion, check out our other discussions here and get your creative juices flowing. And I shall see you in the next video. Catch you later!